Weekend has now ended around the country, and you wait for numbers from the Electoral Commission to see how many people actually registered to vote. We're having a conversation about voter trends over the last few years in South Africa to examine what they could tell us about what will happen in the polls here when you vote in May. In our studios with us, we have Professor Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance and Angelo, Fick, Head of Research at the Auwal Socio-economic Research Unit. Let's just move to the Western Cape very quickly. And Professor Sarakinsky, if I could start with you. I mean, it's the only province controlled by the Democratic Alliance from 2009, pushed its share of the vote up in 2014. In 2016, got a two-thirds majority in the city of Cape Town. And I think, as critics would say, implosion was perhaps the result. After that, there have been several dynamics. Patricia de Lille's gone. Musi Maimane seems to almost being challenged. This week, Gwen Ngwenya resigned as head of policy. There's a lot that seems to be going on in the DA suddenly.
Yes, and we've been watching that one quite closely to get a sense of what that's all about and whether this will have an impact on the numbers in 2019. So the issue is, will Patricia de Lille be able to take some support with her? So as mayor, she was instrumental in getting that two-thirds majority. Will she be able to carry voters, not just coloured voters, any voters in that area, to come with her into her good party? And that's an unknown. We've got no indications of that yet. What we do have indications are of some really important by-elections in the Western Cape, especially the West Coast. And the DA has taken a bit of a hit. And the ANC's won wards that they lost in 2016. So we shouldn't take by-elections at local level as anything other than indicative. But it does suggest that the DA is losing some support in parts of the Western Cape. To lose 20% of your votes 2016 to late 2018 in 2 years, that is really significant. And the vote will tell us whether the shenanigans inside the DA have resulted in a loss of voter confidence, and whether Patricia de Lille has been able to capitalise on that. I can't see the ANC taking the Western Cape, though.
Angelo, race and class divide in the Western Cape is certainly something that would give an indication of perhaps what would happen in the Western Cape. I asked you a few moments ago if the issue of the coloured vote is something that will be quite critical in this election. You've got Patricia de Lille, who played a very important role, as the Prof has indicated, not just with the coloured vote, but it's very early for her to say if she would make any inroads. Some are arguing that she formed this political party way too late. She doesn't have enough time. But what are the key issues that you think in the Western Cape would be? The ANC is failing, on the other hand, to cut through that racial divide that we see in the Western Cape.
So one of the first things that I think should be taken into account is the internal dynamic of the Democratic Alliance.
Yeah.
And as Professor Sarakinsky has pointed out, there are very specific internal dynamics that we've seen, and as Stephen's pointed out, from the evidence that we've seen. But that's just the surface. I think beneath that surface, there are complicated dynamics. And one of those complicated dynamics that I think spills outside of the DA is the speaking to voters in raced terms. So I'm one of those people who have argued for almost 20 years now that it is important for us to recognise the effects of the Population Registration Act categories of 1950, recognise that they were abolished in 1993, and begin to think more complexly about the social dynamic of South Africa beyond those categories. So I don't think of something like the coloured vote as existing. I think political parties speak to voters in raced terms to mask over class differences. And in the Western Cape, this is a particular issue, because when people talk about the coloured vote, there are all sorts of people that they would include as coloured that they would not include in those kinds of block voting. So they mean those previous under the National Party serviced townships for people who were classified as coloured and were now declassified. In certain ways, they speak to those. So Mitchell's Plain, Hanover Park, Heideveld, Manenberg, that's what they're talking about. And those people inhabit class positions in relation to contemporary South Africa. When we look at those areas which are often adjacent to them that used to be designated black areas, so Guguletu, Langa, and Nyanga, what we see there are longer standing traditions of ANC activity, ANC presence. But when we start looking at the ANC in the Western Cape, it has its own internal class dynamic through the UDF history. That means that people who would have been called coloured, so people like Ibrahim Rasool, who is in the ANC and is in the Western Cape, are not covered by the so-called coloured black vote, block vote. So what we're, I think, looking for in the Western Cape is the ways in which class become masked by race, and the way in which political parties use race to speak to potential voters, and the way in which those voters understand themselves in those terms, those raced terms, in order to respond and reward parties for what they think they're going to get, and to punish parties for what they think they've been excluded from.
Will that explain to an extent why Peter Murray, who was in the tricameral parliament representing a coloured vote, is now a representative or a person, a candidate for the Western Cape Premiership for a party that I would have seen as ethnic Afrikaans, the Freedom Front Plus?
Well, one doesn't want to be too cynical, but these are the days of miracle and wonder. We have seen all sorts of political relationships that shouldn't have been on paper, where people have ideological differences that are so severe that you think, what are they doing together? So Mesuwe Lekota with AfriForum, Peter Murray with Freedom Front Plus. All of these things, I think, are symptoms, and I think they're morbid symptoms, of a certain kind of political culture in South Africa, where it's access to resources and access to power over all sorts of other opportunities and possibilities. I also think it's important for voters to begin to demand that parties speak to them in the terms that are useful in a depressed economy for them economically, not just the old raced terms. And I think it is important for, civil society to start taking on this use of race, and often verging on racism itself, to manufacture political support where there's no reason to proceed in that way.
Shall we move to the Northwest?
Yeah, let's move to the Northwest. I do want to just touch on one thing but before we do that. Professor Sarakinsky, I mean, in a way, I think what Angelo is getting to is a much bigger question, which is about turnout, national turnout. We know that in local government elections, turnout's, a lot lower than it is in national elections. And yet, I mean, there are various pieces in the Sunday newspapers today. It's a sort of lament on talk radio. You see it on Twitter. Who would I vote for? I've been asked the question many times. Who should I vote for by someone? You can't give an individual voter advice. But there is a frustration, I think, with the sort of what I would call the political elites or the political parties that we currently have, or the big three, or whatever you want to term it. And yet voters will often, so let me as a voter say to you, what do I do if I'm frustrated with all of the parties? And the answer is nothing, I suppose.
Nothing. It's very difficult to give advice to voters. Voters have to make their decision. What we've got in South Africa at the moment is a real problem for democracy, in that voters aren't identifying the party that best represents them. They're trying to find a party that they can live with. The least worst. In other words, they want to vote for something that their conscience will allow them to, but they still wouldn't vote for them under normal circumstances. And that's a real problem, because the outcome isn't going to reflect what citizens really want. We've got a whole lot of ambiguity now in terms of what the mandate is that these parties have received from the electorate. And that creates all kinds of legitimacy and performance challenges, because we're putting people in office, but we don't know why we're putting them in office. And we don't know what we expect from them once they're in office. We're hoping for the best, basically.
Is that, Angelo, because of the structure? I'm sorry, Chriselle.
No, go ahead.
Is that because of the structure of our democracy? And by that I'm talking about proportional representation. So you have proportional representation on top of racialized inequality. That makes it maybe difficult for new groups to form, or new groups, you would think it might make it easier, but it actually maybe doesn't. Or there's a sort of hold that political elites currently have that makes it harder for new organizations to get going.
I think that goes somewhere towards explaining it, but I think there's also something about civics education. So we have millions of people who, don't see themselves in the big three, and have forgotten that there are hundreds of other political parties that are also out there. And if you were to ask a whole bunch of voters how many parties are standing in the place where they will vote, and how many of those manifestos and promises and ideas do they know, and which of those, should they get to learn to know them, would they be able to identify with, you might get a slightly more complicated picture. But because there is this idea that winner takes all, and therefore I must back the winner, there is a very strange culture in this country. And I'm not talking about working class people, I'm often talking about middle class people, people with degrees, people who should have everything available to them to make a choice as Ivor says, that is about what my values are and identifying a party that shares that value and voting for that party based on those values. Then it's not about whether you have an individual or whether you have a party, because you'd have the same problem, which is you need to be able to identify an organization or an individual whose values reflect yours and vote for them. And for a great many people, that is actually the case. If you speak to ordinary voters, I always bring up this example of the woman in the Donga in Kwanyamazane outside Mbombela, who says, I vote for this particular party because 20 years ago I couldn't sit here and trade these wild vegetables that I picked in the forest. So her voting is rational, she's identified values and she's identified benefits. And I think we forget that people do this all the time as well. And they do this in a culture where they don't identify beyond the big five.
Gentlemen, before we run out of time, let's move to the Northwest now. We saw those pictures. Basically, Supremo Mapilo being chased out by his own people, of course, the ANC's stronghold for as long as we can remember. Service delivery issues. I mean, we saw what happened already over this weekend, where communities are saying enough is enough. They're not happy with the services that they're receiving from their municipalities. But would this affect the ANC, and to what degree? Given the fact that in the Northwest you've got Supremo Mapilo, you've got a new premier, but you've seen Supremo Mapilo challenge this very decision in the courts itself, something that he previously said he would not do. So would this uncertainty within the ANC in the Northwest affect it?
Well, you would think with the ANC in disarray as it has been for quite a long time now, and I use the term disarray because it's not a collapse, it's a disarray, it's internal squabbling. The opposition parties will have done better, but it is an indictment on South Africa's opposition parties, plural, that they've not been able to exploit the ANC's internal strife and public issues better, which means that voters in voting for the ANC in the numbers that they have, if you look at those municipal results, the numbers of municipalities the ANC won in, if you look at the 2014 results, it shows you that those voters do not believe the opposition is offering them a real alternative possibility.
But
and so they're going.
A shift?
It is entirely open to what is being on offer from opposition parties. I seriously doubt that the ANC is in that level of disarray, and the two opposition parties in the province that have made headway can gain enough traction over the next 5 months to exploit this and come to governance. The same issue that applies in Gauteng, and in the Western Cape will apply in a different way in the Northwest, which is that the opposition in the Western Cape is, in disarray, the ANC. The opposition in the Northwest is in equal disarray, the EFF and the DA.
I suppose, Professor Sarakinsky, what that brings us to then is that the biggest threat to the ANC in Northwest is the ANC, and these sort of long-running rumours, I don't know how much credence we can give them, that someone like Mahumapelo would be involved or be behind, but not necessarily publicly backing a new party. There is some sort of new, Mzwanele Money has things happening. There are all sorts of different things happening around smaller parties at the moment. Some of them seem very complex, difficult to know what's happening. I mean, do you see that as a risk to the ANC in the Northwest at all, or is that just great for Sunday papers?
I don't think it's a great risk. I don't think it's going to threaten their majority. It might mean that the numbers come down some percentile points. The issue for me here is that if one looks at the protests to try and get rid of Mahumapelo, that was pretty widespread across Northwest. It wasn't localized in any particular area. There was almost a mass insurrection against him. Now, with the cleanup, with Job Mogoro there, it might well be that he can pull those people back into the ANC and the numbers remain constant or even go up in terms of the ANC responding to the complaints which led to those protests mid last year. So it's a bit of one, it's a bit of the other. It's difficult to read. You only know what happened after the election.
But that could lead to a bit of trouble if you've got the ANC in the Northwest so divided. Could that perhaps not give other opposition parties a piece of the pie? Because clearly what you're seeing in the Northwest at this stage is that there are strong supporters. I remember being outside the South Gauteng High Court where you had so many supporters behind Supremo Mapilo who believed that the ANC had basically dealt him a blow.
The opposition parties are at fault here because they haven't been able to get into the local conditions and mobilize and build support to compete in the election on these kinds of issues. They've come with their blanket national issues which haven't resonated with the local constituencies and the local conditions. And it's their fault that they haven't been able to capitalize on this. Same in the Free State. The ANC will still return a significant majority in the Free State, despite the legacy of Ace Makashule. And that's simply because the opposition parties are remarkably ineffective in capitalizing on ANC dysfunction and ANC policy failure.
Let's look at that at the Free State. I mean, the ANC got 69.85% in 2014. I mean, Angelo, it really is a stronghold. I mean, the rest of the provinces really are ANC strongholds. It seems almost insurmountable that you can actually get that something dramatic can happen.
Yes, but the difficulty, I think, in South Africa is that what people see as success is quite the opposite of school leaving exam marks. So while you need 30% to pass in an exam at the end of grade 12, the ANC is seen to, if they get below 70% or in some places below 80%, they're seen to have failed. So we've seen significant drops in support for the ANC at provincial level in the Northwest and in Limpopo in 2014. That the ANC will have to account for, because anywhere else in the world, any political party that got 60% of the vote would celebrate outright. It would not even blink. But in South Africa, 60%, if it's down from 65, is seen as failure. If we go back to the municipal elections, it lost 3 metro, councils. That would not be seen as a significant loss. It won over 100 and something other municipal councils. So, if you look at the map of South Africa, it would be mostly green for municipalities. But because these were significant symbolic cities, the loss was felt and collective responsibility was taken for it. And so I think if the ANC drops its numbers into the 50s, we might see a normalization of South Africa's political landscape where opposition parties might see an opportunity to start thinking of coalitions and wresting control away. But as Ivor says, and as I agree, if the opposition parties can't pull the ANC below 60, it's not just the ANC or the voters. And so blaming voters for their behavior is, I think, 1, anti-democratic, and 2, very stupid. Voters behave in ways that politicians want them to behave. If you give voters choice and they don't want it, you can't be that angry so-called incel who now says, well, why doesn't she want to go on a date with me? The voter has spoken. You said this is what you would get if you vote for me, and the voter said, well, I don't want that.
Well, the EFF's just over 8%. Do you think sentiments shared by the likes of the EFF's Julius Malema, who's consistently harped on the issue of Ace Makashule being corrupt? The ANC had decided to put Ace Makashule in the high-ranking position within the African National Congress. And would that perhaps bite into the piece of the pie of the ANC in the Free State, or would that just be too minimal? Prof, you'd already indicated that the opposition parties haven't seemed to have capitalized on the scandals surrounding Ace Makashule. So this time around, with the EFF consistently they've been on his neck, basically. Ace Makashule's neck. Would that bite a bit into the pie of the ANC in the Free State at all?
Not necessarily, because the people making these allegations have their own scandals behind them. And in politics, if you're going to criticize someone for bad behavior, your house has to be in order. In other words, in politics, you can't throw stones if you live in a glass house yourself.
Yeah.
And that's neutralizing the quite crude attack on the ANC in terms of the corruption. I think the policy failure issues would be far more powerful in getting voters to listen in terms of healthcare, in terms of provision of services at local level. Those failures which affect people on their daily lives in terms of waking up in the morning and coming back at night and children having to go to school in between. That's where I think enormous mobilization could take place. To scream and shout about corruption when you yourself may well be involved in corruption isn't getting the voter to think you're any different to the devil that we already know.
So they're not sticking to the bread and butter issues. Sorry, Stephen. The bread and butter issues is what matters here.
Yes, and if we go into the Free State, this is a province in which the Premier himself, the then Premier himself, was implicated in the scandal around, and there was a grassroots movement against the way in which healthcare was mismanaged by the provincial government. None of the opposition parties got on board with that groundswell movement. And so what happens is that you leave this space out to become an ANC factional battle, which is what I think part of the Northwest is. So those crowds that turned up to protest against Supra Mahomapelo, who's, it's almost impossible to imagine that that's just spontaneous. I think there was some spontaneity, but there was also internal organization, because the internal dynamic of the ANC is about those factions that was so denied by the Secretary General at the time for years. So what I think the issues on the ground are, and this is where I think the Western Cape, the DA did its work really well in the 1990s and 2000s, was to speak to, sometimes quite cynically, local issues.
Yeah.
And I think it is important for any political movement and for any voter to ask, what are the local issues that I have and which party speaks to those issues?
All right, we'll continue this conversation. So many more provinces to go through. We're going to ask our guests to stay with us for another few minutes just to wrap this up. You're with The Full View at 7 o'clock.